Hi everyone, I'm Jaya Vishwanathan, and you've found the No Brainer podcast where I discuss all things neuroscience in delightful conversations with various experts. I hope you enjoy today's episode.
Yeah. So you've actually touched upon several things that I'm really passionate about myself, and policy is certainly one of them. But I also maybe want to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of what we can prevent, like preventable risk factors. Like I think, one of them is like education and making sure people have access to education. And for a little bit of context, both Beth and I are part of this diversities and disparities kind of professional interest group within iStart. And some of the work that has come out of this group included things like investigating more into the social and structural determinants. And one of the papers I think we both worked on, it was very interesting to kind of look at things that are at the macro scale, like racism and ageism and how that can influence adverse health outcomes versus things that are maybe on the smaller scale, like neighborhood disparities. It's still hard to address, but maybe some of them are maybe a little bit more amorphous than others to address. Sorry for my long-winded question, but this is a very fascinating topic, and I'd like to dig into it a little bit. So when it comes to your approaches experimentally, day to day, how do you design experiments? How do you think about how to quantify some of these things? What kind of determines, other than your own personal interest, like what kind of things are going to be achievable in a lifetime, because some of these, like, we're not going to fix structural racism in a lifetime, right? Like, at least I don't think we will. But maybe that's the pessimist in me.
Well, I hope we do a really good job of biting off these very difficult problems. And what I'm really excited about in the Alzheimer's disease research space is that there are so many researchers who care about these difficult problems. But you're right, it's very difficult even to measure some of these things and to agree amongst ourselves how we define them. But for some structural measures, folks are working on that. I am not an expert in structural racism, but there are folks whose expertise is in that area, and they are putting together measures that could be used to quantify that. And so I think part of the cool work of being a researcher is constantly being able to learn, biting off a new problem that you want to learn about and learning about it. And so one of those things is measurement. And we have to think about the multiple levels of exposures, exactly what you're talking about individual level, but then also neighborhood level, macro level, where we have sort of policies and normative behavior. And so I think some of the ways that we try to understand more things in epidemiology studies, those are often observational studies where we can characterize exposures that an individual has and then larger levels. So those are sort of multi-level models, if you've heard them called that, or the frameworks in which we think about these things are ecological frameworks where we have growing sort of levels of exposure. And there are ways to deal with that analytically where you can incorporate the individual level and then these increasing levels of sort of societal exposure. And so I think those are really exciting ways to start to think about how to actually ask and answer these questions. I'm not usually doing experiments of the type that, say, a basic science or, neuroscientist who works with animal models, or even someone who does, a randomized controlled trial. I'm not a clinical trialist. So it's more so using observational studies to collect this data and then refine what we think we know about causes.
Oh, that is very cool. So maybe a question that would be interesting to our listeners would be, what are some of these measurements? Like, I'm assuming you use surveys, but do you use things like the census? Like, what are some of the sources for
Yes,
gathering these kind of data?
absolutely. So yes, at an individual level, we often, in the studies that I work in, we often do, we do physical exams and cognitive assessments and neuroimaging at the individual level. But then we also may collect sort of geospatial information. And so if we have participants' addresses, we can
I
map
see.
those, we can geocode them and map them onto census data or other sort of geospatial based data. So you may have heard lately folks have been doing some work looking at things like the area deprivation index, which is a measure of sort of neighborhood level deprivation. You can look at other spatial factors like pollution
Yeah.
or even other things that occur at various geographic sizes. Yes. And then you can sort of create these clustered models that account for the fact that you have individual level data and then, more community level data.
Yeah, so that is very, very helpful information. So I'm assuming something like, and if this example is wrong, let me know. But say something like wildfires, and then you can kind of map back health outcomes from people within a certain geographical exposure area around it. Am I right? Is that
Yeah, and
right? But yeah, okay.
I think there was some interesting new research that came out about that at AAIC this past summer, the 2024 international meeting of
Right.
Alzheimer's researchers, and it was in Philadelphia this past year.
Yeah.
And yes, I think there was new data that came out showing that exposure to wildfire seems to be associated with dementia risk.
Yeah. So I want to go back to something that you said earlier. I just kind of filed it away to ask later, and that's
Okay.
about biking.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's so fascinating, talking about exercise and biking. So, one of the questions I think about is also with aging, what kind of exercise is like good? Because there's so many different types, right? There's aerobic, cardio, anaerobic, just yoga, so, and I'm not an expert in exercise science, but if you'd like to talk more about biking in specifically and why you recommend biking as a preventative measure for dementia, I think that would be very cool.
Yeah, so just to expand on it a little bit, this is, the idea that this would need to be done in collaboration with sort of city planners and policymakers
Sure.
to put trails in cities and neighborhoods.
Hmm.
So I think, and I would like to recommend, I'm personally not much of a biker. Um, but it's because for me, there's not great infrastructure
I see.
where I live that makes me feel safe enough to want to do it. There's a lot of on-street biking that would have to be done, and I don't like that very much.
Right.
However, what I will say is anything that's going to sort of, get your heart rate up a bit, make it a little bit more difficult for you to breathe and talk freely, that is something that is good for you. And so that could be walking, running, biking, whatever it is. And so, for example, during my PhD, I did some work in a randomized controlled trial of physical activity for older adults who were at risk of mobility disability. So it was designed to prevent progressing to being disabled with your mobility.
Right.
Wasn't focused necessarily on dementia outcomes. And those folks had a physical activity intervention where they were doing moderate physical activity, but it was walking and it was achievable. And so I think what I've come to think about the evidence is that, the best intervention in some ways is one that you're actually going to do. And
Right.
so, if you're starting at a place where you're doing nothing, you may not immediately ramp up to bicycling. And you may feel like me. You may not feel very comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
But for sure, walking around your neighborhood might be something that feels more achievable to you. Or going to a shopping mall and walking inside if you live somewhere where it's very hot or not necessarily safe to walk around your neighborhood might be, an alternative thing that you can do. So I do think there are a lot of people working on the evidence that doing something is better than doing nothing. And we also shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? We need to do something.
I love that. Thank you for saying that, because I think that certainly makes me feel better about my exercise regimen. I do like running, but it's not always possible to have a run outside or whatever. But I really like what you just said about, doing the best exercise is the one that's going to be achievable. I like that, and I'm going to put like a plaque of it on my desk to motivate me, and I encourage our listeners to also take that advice to heart. So, what are some of the things that you're excited about working in the space of dementia prevention?
Yeah, I mean, I think you get the sense from our talks that we've had that I think that there are some people who like to hone in on a very specific strand and focus on that very intensely. And I'm so grateful there are people like that in the world. But I am really interested in big picture and thinking about lots of different things. And so right now I'm really excited about something called population neuroscience syndemics. And so this is something that we've been working on again in the group that you mentioned earlier, Jaya. That's a sex and gender differences special interest group that is interested specifically in diversity and equity. And we've been playing with the idea that, so syndemics comes from really the infectious disease space. And it's the idea that there might be synergistic epidemics, so multiple epidemics occurring at the same time, and that the co-occurrence of these diseases, as well as social determinants, social and structural determinants of health, likely intensifies the diseases and makes them worse. Exposes folks to stress that makes the situation worse. And so in that group, we've been doing some work with another work group, the Low and Middle Income Countries Working Group, thinking about how these very difficult, how both sort of the modifiable factors for dementia that have been discussed a lot by us in this conversation, education, physical activity, hypertension, and so on, how those modifiable factors, but then also how these really difficult entrenched factors that are more likely to be negatively experienced in low and middle income countries, such as, conflict, climate change, pollution, migration, and so on. That these factors may be interacting in really important ways, and that we should think about how that's impacting dementia risk. And so that's one of the pieces of work that I'm really interested in right now. And so we're working on a paper for that. So everyone should keep their eyes peeled. Hopefully it will be coming out soon.
Yeah, and one of the things I really appreciate about your work too is, I am an immigrant myself, and I, find that there's so little research or attention paid to some of the things that, yes, I think and it's such a complex, and just that one thing, and you talked about so many like conflict and other things, But just from personal experience, right? Like, yes, when you move around to a different country, there's all these new stresses because you're in unfamiliar circumstances, and you have to build up both resistance and resilience to those. And so it does do that, but then it's also like changing your exposures, and then you have this whole social component to it, like where you've left people who are part of your family and friend circle, and now you have to integrate into a whole new. And there's just no research on immigrants that I am kind of convinced by, and so I think this is such an important thing to start focusing on, because it's become more easy than ever before to just hop on a flight and be somewhere that you've never been before, and kind of the globalization issue, the flip side is people are now accumulating more complex things into their bodies and their psyches and minds and brains. So I really appreciate, I want to say, you being a pioneer in this field as an immigrant.
Thank you.
Feel very happy that there's people like you working on such a complex topic, and I'm personally looking forward to reading all of your future work anyway. So I want to pivot a little bit to talking about some of your research. I mean, you kind of mentioned it throughout the episode, but kind of talking about recruitment and equity and engagement. So, we've talked a lot about these social and structural determinants, but, we know that a lot of research in neuroscience anyway is kind of based on, as you mentioned earlier, like these people who are highly educated, highly motivated, kind of coming up and volunteering to participate in studies. And there's, in other minorities, including immigrants, there's a lot of distrust in the government. There's a lot of distrust in the health systems. And so this is, in my mind, one of the most challenging areas that we absolutely need to address if we have to cure Alzheimer's at the global scale. So can you talk about your work in that area?
Absolutely. That would be great. So I work in the Outreach, Recruitment, and Engagement Core at the University of Pittsburgh's Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And as part of that work, what we do is, commit to being out in the community, understanding what it is that the community prioritizes in terms of, things that we can help them with, and just being consistent with that. So in our community in the Pittsburgh area, among older adults, the underrepresented group typically in Alzheimer's disease research that we have in our community is Black and African American identifying individuals. We do have a Latinx population that is growing, but they tend to be younger right now. We are planning for that population to grow, and are building partnerships in the community with organizations that serve them. But so a lot of our work involves partnering and being out in the community, specifically to educate and understand what the African American community prioritizes. We also make sure that we have a community advisory council in which we have community members who consult with us on the research that we do at our ADRC, the outreach and engagement activities that we have, and they're the best. They're so excited to be part of it, and they are, they come up with such great ideas of ways that they can be more involved to be our champions. We really think it's important for us to give back to the community, and so we're consistently there and consistently trying to find ways to engage in education or other tangible benefits that we can give them, such as health fairs where they get screening, or a food drive that we participate in for around the Thanksgiving holiday, and where folks can come get immunizations and so on. So we do try to provide partnership for tangible benefits that folks can walk away with. we make sure that people understand that we value their time. And so we do pay our study participants, we pay folks who volunteer for what we're doing, because we want them to understand that we're valuing what they're giving us and we don't want them to incur any costs. And so we also think about other ways that we can give back to them, which oftentimes results in return of study results that they may have. So when they participate with us, if they get their blood pressure taken, if they have cognitive testing with us, we will give them back study results so they can understand more about how they're doing. And we think that gives them a value and an understanding that we are valuing their volunteerism with us. Yeah. And I would say that some of the work, that I have done lately that's brought me the most excitement has been partnering with our local health department. So we at the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center have partnered with our health department to work on some strategic planning that the health department is doing in our county surrounding treating dementia as a public health problem, and really thinking about, some of the things we were talking about earlier about how we might prevent the disease and how we might talk about that at the community level. Yeah. So that's really exciting work to me that really gets into more and diverse parts of the community that we may not be able to get to otherwise when we're at, such a specialized center as a university.
Yeah, that is fascinating to me. So does your research with recruitment also kind of address the caregiver problem and dementia care issues when you're working with the health department of the county?
I don't know that we have anybody that's looked at that at the county level, no. But I know that we have researchers who are affiliated with our center who do caregiver research.
Oh, how cool. Yeah.
It's not, so that's a really good question, though, whether we could incorporate that more at the county level. And that's a great idea because honestly, that is some of the hardest stuff for families who are taking care of a loved one and, providing that informal care and not knowing how to navigate the system. It's definitely an important area of research.
Yeah, and you talked earlier about sex differences, and I think that the dementia care burden often falls disproportionately, including the Alzheimer's burden itself,
on women.
Falls disproportionately on women, and so which kind of segues into what are your key takeaways about the sex differences that you find in your research in particular?
I think some of the takeaways are women are very fortunate because we live a long life. That has its good parts and its bad parts, and in part that means that we're just exposed to a longer lifetime of risk. And so that is part of what's going on in the sex and gender differences. However, there are other features that I think are really worth investigating to understand things a little bit better. And they seem to be that historically women have been less exposed to the good things that protect us. So historically women were, less likely to go to school for quite as long as men. They were less likely to work outside of the home and have these great occupational exposures that, are really brain activity over the course of your life.
Yeah.
And then they have these sort of, they have both the sex and gendered features. So some of those are gendered features that I was just mentioning, which have to do with, normative beliefs about whether women should be allowed to work or go to school. But then they also have these sex-specific factors that many people are very interested in now. And so the work that some folks are doing includes looking at the menopause as an important, abrupt change in hormonal level and changes in the brain that may lead to vasomotor symptoms like hot flashes. And then I think some of my work that I mentioned earlier is very fascinating about how some of these pregnancy-based exposures may impart, later life dementia risk for women. Pregnancy is a really full body stress test, right? The whole body is remodeling and changing drastically when a woman is pregnant. And so there's a lot more to understand about the vascular remodeling that happens during that time that seems to be important for later life dementia risk. Yep. So I think those are really fascinating areas of research that folks can keep an eye out for.
So I think the listeners just understood why I love talking to you so much, because I don't think I've ever heard anybody describe a pregnancy as a full body stress test, which is just a fabulous. I think the dictionary should redefine pregnancy as such. I love that. And thank you for sharing it with us. And I think
absolutely.
It's great to know that and understand that there are people like you who are doing this research to help us understand these risk factors better. So what advice would you give people, high schoolers, grad students who are interested in kind of getting into this area of research?
Well, I think one thing I suppose I wish I knew about earlier, well, not so much knew, but felt sort of internally earlier, right, was that you are capable. If you want to do something, you should try and do it. I needed a little bit of encouragement, I think, for a while, and it was very important to me. The mentor that I mentioned to you earlier, who was there at the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center when I worked as staff, doing cognitive testing, she really encouraged me to go back to school. And so in some ways I couldn't necessarily see fully for myself that I was capable of it, but having this encouraging person who was convinced that I was capable of it really encouraged me to do it. And so I think believing in yourself, trying the things that you want to try, and maybe surrounding yourself with the people who believe in you and who are going to cheerlead for you, I think those are really the important pieces to my story. And I feel very fortunate, I think people in academia have different stories about how they progressed through things. Yeah. And I worked for a time before I went back for my PhD. Yeah. And I'm really grateful for that experience. It gave me a lot of really hands-on experience with research participants and so on. And so even though you may feel like your career path is a little bit different than someone else's, it doesn't matter. You bring something very valuable to the table. So yeah.
Well, and also thank you for sharing that vulnerability. I think a lot of people internalize, I've certainly, when I was in grad school, had like the imposter syndrome, and I think, and women are certainly more prone to that, and if you're not familiar, imposter syndrome is this feeling that you don't belong in this higher education echelon or high achieving echelon that you find yourself in. While other people might be feeling similar thoughts, but people tend not to share. And so I really appreciate you openly sharing that and to overcome and do what you love anyway. I think that is just beautiful advice. So thank you for sharing that. And are there any final thoughts that you would like to share with us about, some of your future work? I know you already talked about the paper earlier in this episode, but are there other projects that you're working on? Or
maybe one other piece that I'll highlight for people, this may be a bit of a ways off, but an interesting set of ideas that we're thinking about is I'm thinking more and more about intersectional sort of identities and exposures. And so I think you can, this is the idea that multiple identities or structural factors may interact in important ways. So
Okay.
it fits in very well with the idea of syndemics that I mentioned earlier. And one way that we're really implementing this is by thinking about gendered racism in the context of the study I mentioned earlier about hypertensive disorders of pregnancy history, and then what those exposures look like for women's cognitive and brain health. And so that's a set of ideas that I'm thinking a lot about right now.
Well, So, I would love for you to expand on intersectionality, but we will wait and we'll have you back after your paper comes out and talk about it then. And I think people would love to hear. Maybe you can just talk about that paper in particular. And we look forward to your future work. And thank you so much for making the time to share your wisdom and expertise with our listeners today. And we really, really appreciate having you as a guest, and I've really enjoyed my conversation. And as every other conversation I've had with you, I'm walking away having learned several things new.
Awesome.
So thank you.
I'm so glad to hear that, Jaya. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Perfect.
Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed this episode of the No Brainer podcast and see you at the next one.